The 20th century was a very pivotal period for American history. Taking a look back, there's a stark difference between the year 1900 and the year 1999, and we owe this to the numerous social movements that took place during this century. Throughout this presentation, I am going to be focusing more so on the social reforms because these movements are what truly shaped American society today. The relationship between political progressivism and social movements has not always been harmonious, cooperative, or even symbiotic. Social movements, by definition, arise from a committed minority of citizens working together to shape larger public consciousness about particular injustices, in addition to working for concrete political change. Social movements have invariably advanced moral and political causes surrounding gender, racial, and class equality with much greater force and consistency than those in mainstream politics. To start this presentation off, I am going to be discussing the women's movement because obviously this specific part of American history is extremely important for me as I am a woman. World War II was instrumental in the origins of the women's movement. The classic image of Rosie the Riveter reflected the fact that millions of women went into factories when men were mobilized into the military. And there was a lingering split from the 1920s between future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and feminist leader of the National Woman's Party, Alice Paul. Roosevelt fought to keep protective legislation for women in terms of working hours or physical tasks, and Paul wanted an equal rights amendment that made women completely equal under the law. Post-war American culture was rather conservative and supported traditional roles for women. The images of women as mothers and homemakers on the new media of television were quite reflective of the reality for many suburban women. The marriage rate was increasing. A baby boom resulted in more than 76 million births between the years 1946 and 1964, and the divorce rate dropped. The American people supported traditional roles for women, and women who didn't fit the cookie-cutter role were often looked down upon, especially divorced women. This next clip is from a scene from the movie 20th Century Woman, and the narrator is reading an excerpt from a 1970s novel about a feminist's plight as a divorced woman during that time. I think this perfectly exemplifies how women felt if they didn't fit in during the 1960s.
I am gregarious, interested in others, and I think intelligent. All I ask is to get to know people and to have them interested in knowing me. I doubt whether I would marry again and live that close to another individual, but I remain invisible. Don't pretend for a minute, as you look at me, that I am not as alive as you are, and I do not suffer from the category to which you are forcing me. I think, stripped down, I look more attractive than my ex-husband, but I am sexually and socially obsolete, and he is not.
Again, I think that essay speaks to many divorced women of that time. Zoe Moss, who is the author of that essay, describes herself as sexually and socially obsolete. The essay is called "It Hurts to Be Alive and Obsolete," and I think it speaks to many women who were divorced because women did not want to associate with her and men did not want to be with divorced women. Many changes were developing for women's equality in employment and education. By 1960, the number of women working had risen to 35% of the workforce, with increasing numbers of married women. Women were attending higher education in higher numbers, earning nearly 40% of the degrees by 1960, and the numbers would continue to grow. In May 1960, the FDA approved the oral contraceptive, the pill, for women, and millions of women were soon using it for birth control despite the fact that many states outlawed contraceptives. The pill changed the sexual lives for women throughout the nation. Women's careers would not be shortened by unanticipated pregnancies, and women would have fewer children. Women underwent intense scrutiny to win the same independence that men had, and after fighting long and hard, women were able to do the same things as men. With court cases like Roe v. Wade and having to deal with societal pressures to be a perfect mom and wife, women had to deal with all of that back in the 20th century so that 21st century women can have conversations about sexual assault and the wage gap and still be able to create more changes. The next major social movement that I would like to talk about is the civil rights movement. Although slavery had been abolished, racism was very much still institutionalized in America. However, after a few centuries of abuse, African Americans had obviously had enough, and it was clearly time for a change. Even though all Americans had gained the right to vote, many southern states made it difficult for blacks. They often required them to take voter literacy tests that were confusing, misleading, and nearly impossible to pass, and that's going to be shown in this very next clip.
I ain't starting no fuss. I'm just here trying to register to vote. Recite the Constitution's preamble. You know what a preamble is? We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. How many county judges in Alabama? 67. Name them.
So, yes, the following was a clip from the movie Selma, and it is a perfect example of what black people had to go through just to vote. The Eisenhower administration wanted to show a commitment to the civil rights movement and minimize racial tensions in the South, so they pressured Congress to consider new civil rights legislation. On September 9, 1957, President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 into law, the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. It allowed federal prosecution of anyone who tried to prevent someone from voting, and in 1965, another Voting Rights Act was made by President Johnson banning all voter literacy tests and provided federal examiners in certain voting jurisdictions. Despite making some gains, blacks still experienced blatant prejudice in their daily lives, and on February 1st, 1960, young African American students staged a sit-in at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and refused to leave after being denied service. The sit-in movement soon spread to college towns throughout the South, though many of the protesters were arrested for trespassing, disorderly conduct, or disturbing the peace. Their actions made an immediate and lasting impact, forcing Woolworths and other establishments to change their segregationist policies. The fight for racial equality seems never-ending, and in many respects, it has still continued to this day. Police brutality is still very much prevalent in today's society, and with tools like Twitter, Americans have more access to viewing such racism, making people much more aware of the treatment of black people in today's age. However, to say that we as a society have not grown since the civil rights movement would be wrong. Public places have become integrated, and racism that was strictly institutionalized is slowly but surely filtering out. America still has much more to do to be free of racism, but we are on our way. The final social movement that I would like to touch on is the fight for LGBT rights. Although this topic isn't talked about extensively in U.S. history classes, it is still a very important part of American history. In 1953, being homosexual was officially considered a mental illness, and people were being treated as if they were mentally ill. The following year, President Dwight Eisenhower signed an executive order that banned gay people, or more specifically people of quote-unquote sexual perversion, from federal jobs. This ban would remain in effect for some 20 years. The gay rights movement saw some early progress in the 1960s. LGBT individuals lived in a kind of urban subculture and were routinely subjected to harassment and persecution, such as in bars and restaurants. In fact, gay men and women in New York City could not be served alcohol in public due to liquor laws that considered the gathering of homosexuals to be disorderly. In 1966, members of the Mattachine Society in New York City staged a sip-in, a twist on the sit-in protests of the 1960s, in which they visited taverns, declared themselves gay, and waited to be turned away so they could sue. They were denied service at the Greenwich Village Tavern Julius, resulting in much publicity and the quick reversal of the anti-gay liquor laws. A few years later, in 1969, a now very famous event that really became the catalyst of the gay rights movement was known as the Stonewall riots. In the early hours of June 28, 1969, New York police raided the Stonewall Inn, which was a place that allowed dancing and welcomed drag queens and homeless youths. Fed up with years of police harassment, patrons and neighborhood residents began throwing objects at police as they loaded the arrested into paddy wagons. The scene eventually exploded into a full-blown riot, with subsequent protests that lasted for 5 more days. By the 1970s, several openly LGBT individuals secured public office positions. The most notable one would be Harvey Milk. He campaigned on a pro-gay rights platform and became the first San Francisco city supervisor in 1978, becoming the first openly gay man elected to a political office in California. Although these were amazing movements in the LGBT community, things quickly took a turn for the worst. On November 27, 1978, the former supervisor Dan White crept into City Hall with a .38 revolver, and White had resigned his post just months earlier and unsuccessfully asked that he be reinstated. He became angry that Milk won and killed him. Then in the 1980s, there was an AIDS outbreak, further creating a massive stigma against people who are LGBT and created more violence against them. There was a lot more violence inflicted upon them due to the AIDS outbreak. It was known as the gay disease. More was to come with Don't Ask, Don't Tell being passed in 1992, which did little to stop people from being discharged on the grounds of their sexuality. Eventually, however, states did start lifting their bans against gay marriages, and society slowly started becoming more accepting of it. However, gay marriage wasn't fully legalized in the states until 2015. They were, however, allowed domestic partnerships. And this was a great movement in the LGBT community. However, to this day, there are still not enough anti-discrimination laws for the LGBT community in the workplace. Gay rights proponents must also contend with an increasing number of religious liberty state laws, which allow businesses to deny service to LGBT individuals due to religious belief, as well as bathroom laws that prevent transgender individuals from using public bathrooms that don't correspond to their sex at birth. Overall, America is still very much fighting for equal rights amongst race, class, sexuality, gender. There's still so much more to go. However, without all of the social movements that took place during that time, women and African Americans would not be able to vote. This country would be much more divided, and honestly, only white males would benefit from living in a world where none of these social justice movements took place. The 20th century is, in my opinion, the most interesting time period to study. The literature, the music, the art, and the history are all so enticing to learn. There was so much change that took place, and America would not be what it is today without the history that took place in the 1900s.